of Health, Producing Ireland's New Health System in Transition report. And her research also focuses on comparative health systems, health inequalities, and the politics of reform. Sara is also the co-director of the National Sphere PhD programme, which you might know, and teaches widely on health policy and systems. You're very welcome, Sara. We also have on the far end, we have Professor Alan Barrett from the ESRI. So Professor Alan Barrett is a research professor at the ESRI and adjunct professor at Trinity College, formerly ESRI CEO as of 2015. He also served on Ireland's Fiscal Advisory and Climate Change Advisory Councils and chaired the National Economic Dialogue, also a member of the Royal Irish Academy, an honorary fellow of the Society of Actuaries of Ireland, chair of the Commission on Care for Older People, and a member of the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. Very welcome, Alan. We have Leonora Harty here on my right. So Leonora Harty is Assistant Principal in the Strategic Policy and Research Engagement Unit at DFHERIS, leading efforts under Impact 2030 to strengthen connections between researchers and policymakers. Over 20 years of experience in higher education and research policy, and has also served as Ireland's national contact point for European programmes, including Science for Policy and ER schemes. You also hold a BA in Economics and a Master's in Economic Policy Analysis from the University of Galway. Very welcome, Leonora. And last but not least, we have Johnathan Dalzell, who is Dr. Johnathan Dalzell, who is Deputy Director of Science Engagement and Science Advice at DAERA. I don't have the acronym listed there. We'll have to come at the Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Rural Affairs, thank you, where he leads cross-government science engagement and supports evidence-informed policy on sustainable agri-food, One Health and rural affairs. Johnathan also chairs DAERA's One Health Community of Practice, fostering collaboration across governments, academia, NGOs and communities, and previously has held senior roles as CEO of the Northern Ireland Museums Council, Head of Grassland and Plant Science at AFBI, and Senior Lecturer at the Queen's University, Belfast. You're very welcome. And I suppose all that just tells us that we have a hugely expert panel, which we are so thrilled and delighted to have you with us today, because it's very difficult to get this much expertise in one room. So hoping today that our discussion will explore how researchers and policymakers can work together more effectively, and the challenges and opportunities of collaboration across the island of Ireland. So that's a very a very unique aspect to this conversation, which doesn't happen very often, is that piece around looking at our shared Ireland and how we can bridge that gap. And most importantly, how early to mid-career researchers can ensure that their work has real policy impact. So building on what Michael has put in front of us today, thinking about all our various different roles in it, we might just open up with a broad question to the entire panel. So give us the good, the bad and the ugly. What does real effective policy making or collaboration between researchers and policymakers look like in practice on a shared island? Jump in. You can, whoever wants to go first.
Well, look, I can start a little bit on this one anyway. Just to say, so I'm from the. Some of you might have seen me before talking at events, but I used to be from the Evidence for Policy Unit in DFHERIS, and we've kind of restructured a little bit, and we're now the Strategic Policy Research Unit. Strategic Policy and Research Engagement Unit. So we're trying to bring that research piece a little bit closer to the everyday policy making piece. So our department is kind of working under a number of different strategies, but obviously the key one is Impact 2030, the National Research and Innovation Strategy, and both the Shared Ireland initiative and Research for Policy and connecting researchers and policymakers are key objectives under that. But the piece that I work on is that bit around the collaboration and effective collaboration. So just a comment on the Shared Ireland initiative and in particular things like the North-South Research Programme that has run out of the HEA. I suppose it's been very good for our agenda because it's given us an opportunity, and it's interesting today that you're looking at the programme for government actions across the two sides and through that lens, but it's given us an opportunity to, I suppose, build that capacity in areas that we need to support particular policy challenges, and to tap into the expertise across both sides of the, well, I don't want to say the border, but you know what I mean, both north and south. So I think it's been a really useful instrument from that perspective, and I suppose even we are trying to engage with our equivalent up north in Queen's University Belfast, in particular in the Policy Institute there. People like Peter Gillese has been involved in a lot of the initiatives that we're doing, so we're sharing our experience on that bit of actual connectivity between researchers and policymakers. So I think it's just leveraging that knowledge and expertise across the two sides. It's actually been really useful. I mean, the other thing to say, and I always say this, I mean, when you say 20 years, I've clocked up a lot of miles now at this stage, but in a former life, I used to be a national contact point on the European Research Council grants. And that was all about blue skies thinking, or a lot of it was about the bottom up type of research. And I suppose I just wanted to make that point because I don't want that to be lost in our conversations around policy relevant research, is that it's so important that we continue to support that kind of research as well, because the reality is policymakers don't know what the challenges of tomorrow are going to be. And we really need to, while you don't, whatever you're researching doesn't seem to be flavour of the month now, it could be tomorrow. So it's just to make that point. But coming back to effective collaboration, and sorry, I'll stop this now, but I suppose what we're really targeting is around mutual respect and finding those shared areas of engagement. And I suppose collaboration that's based on partnership, moving away from this idea of research being transactional, that, you know, you're not consultants. We're not going out there saying we just want a piece of research and come in and give us this. We need researchers to be involved at all stages of the policy cycle, from designing research questions, co-creating projects, right through to evaluation. And even in terms of the policy processes, I think there's room there for researchers to come in and bring in that innovation around the way we do things and around service delivery. So I suppose effective collaboration, as I see it, it's more about relationship building. That's the key thing, I suppose. Sorry, I went on a bit there.
No, absolutely. You know, to your mic. I think everybody has one. Would anybody else like to jump in on that?
I'm happy to jump in. So you pitched it well, the good, bad, and the ugly. So that's a sort of a way to think about it. Let me begin by saying I've sat around like loads of rooms like this when we're talking about evidence or policy and joining research as policy, and it has a bit of a motherhood and apple pie kind of feel about it. I mean, who could possibly be against this? And yes, it happens much less frequently than we would think. Okay, and I think one of the things I've always done for years now, trying to agonize about this point, well, where is the breakdown? You know, what are the difficulties? So Michael made actually a ton of really valuable points in this, and so maybe just to build on some of them. You know, at one level, you know, and again, we always talk about the same thing about, you know, the work of academics appears in scientific journals and policy makers don't read them. So the first thing, it's a sort of a communication thing, and there's no doubt that that's absolutely part of it. But I push it a little bit sort of further in saying, and maybe to be slightly provocative, there can be a culture clash between the academic and the policy communities. And some colleagues of mine in the ESRI, we were sort of thinking about this a little while ago. And this was actually in consultation with policymakers and academics. And we had this sort of notion about, well, what do policy makers think of researchers and what do researchers think of policymakers? Okay, so look into your souls now and see how you would answer this. But some of the stuff that came up, that policymakers often view researchers as being too abstract, okay, disengaged, ignorant of political realities, don't understand how institutions worked, and then the killer, more concerned with publishing than helping to develop policy. Okay, now they may all say, okay, well, there may be an element of exaggeration in some of these points, but I mean, again, as I say, look into your soul and sort of ask yourself the question, you know, might you be guilty of any of these sort of things? But whether or not you are as researchers, there is a group of policymakers out there, and again, I think you were talking about, you know, this notion of real jobs versus unreal jobs. There is a strand in the sort of the policymaking community that sees academics as, you know, just operating in a sort of a different sphere. To turn that around and researchers' view of policymakers, unreceptive to relevant research, ignorant of key findings and concepts, anti-intellectual, often concerned with managing the politics and focus on easy wins. Okay, so I've listed a whole thing, a set of things there, and okay, as I said, it is exaggerated, but there can be a culture clash between two sides. And I think you have to be sort of cognizant of that before you start making inroads in this area. So again, obviously Michael's talking a big impression on me because I'm quoting it all the time now. But it's that notion of actually building, you know, breaking down those sort of culture clashes, okay? And it does require effort and energy, which is about going to talk to people about the research and engaging and breaking down exactly some of the things that I've talked about there, so that mutual understanding does actually arise over time. But it's a long-term relationship. Okay, it does require energy. And in fairness to a lot of folks here, the ESRI is in a slightly different position here. But I mean, I continually struck in the university setting that a huge onus is put on academic publication. And I think university hierarchies often talk in terms of impact on policy and societal engagement, but I'm not sure how well that translates, okay, into the actual practice in the universities. I'm just going to say a brief thing on the shared island and then move on to the colleagues. I've done a lot of work over the years, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. And the sort of things I've talked about, those culture clashes, are evident both sides of the border. But there is an additional strand of complexity in Northern Ireland. Okay, and I'll say it and then we can discuss it. But in my experience in Northern Ireland, and again, this won't come as a surprise to you, everything is seen through a particular prism. Okay, and if you produce research results that are particularly, say, challenging for one group, the other group might be very enthusiastic and vice versa. And there is a sort of a policy rigidity and a sort of a just a bit of a blockage, which makes the whole policy thing, you know, research policy much more difficult in Northern Ireland. But again, we can come back to that in a few moments, maybe.
But Alan, you jumped off there with the ugly pretty quick. So we really got into the nitty gritty there, because I really love that, you know, that honesty and about there, you know, there's a lot of positives. I think Leonora, like, you really represented that kind of, I think, forward thinking kind of view where we really need to work together. But I mean, I think unearthing some of those traditional tensions between academia and policymakers and hearing from both perspectives, I think is hugely important. I think Johnathan wants to come in on that as well.
Just like smiling, listening to the caricatures there, really, as a formerly an academic and now a policymaker, I feel offended all the way around. But I recognize a lot of that narrative, and there's some truth in it in both sides, but there's a lot of caricatures that just don't manifest in reality all of the time. A lot of great points from Michael, from colleagues already, so I don't want to rehearse any of those. Just to say that you know, I think your purpose here today is absolutely right. Young Academy Ireland should be a voice in the public policy sphere, and I think that's something to pursue, absolutely. And having sat in the seats that you sit in a previous life, I find myself that it could be difficult to get into those policy conversations through nobody's fault. But very often when government engages with academia in particular, it tends to penetrate only so far. Those more senior colleagues who are the first call tend to take up the mantle and try to do their best to support government with evidence. But I'm very passionate about trying to democratize that opportunity to engage. And I think what you're doing today is the start of a productive pathway. And I think really encouraged to be here, to be a part of it. And I would encourage you all to pursue this as an agenda individually and collectively, because remember, your convening power is an asset. Very often our challenge in policy is at a systems level, and you as an individual researcher or, you know, thought leader will be able to address a component part of that. So through your colleagues, you can then bring to bear this transdisciplinary broad expertise that we need to address the big systematic issues that we have in government.
Fantastic, Johnathan. It's great to hear you've straddled both spheres, so I think that's hugely valuable. Sara, would you like to come in?
Yeah, not quite sure where to come in. Maybe just on that, first of all, I'm thrilled to be here, delighted to be asked. Thank you, Kieran. I'm just really pleased that there is this initiative. I don't think there were these initiatives when Alan and I were starting to do this work decades ago. So it's brilliant, it's happening. And I think there's a real strength and safety in the network and the collaboration that you've begun, and wish you the best and willing to support in any way I can. I'm not quite sure what the question is, Jennifer, in terms of like, what do I think it is like now, you know, so I'm going to give you the ugly then, and then what I think it should be, which might be the good. So maybe, you know, and thinking of it in advance, I was thinking, you know, if you think what's the collaboration between research and policy on our shared island, I'd say it's random, it's sporadic, it's ad hoc, it's not resourced, and it's definitely not systemic. Okay, so that will be my take on it. Okay, and obviously I'm coming at it from a perspective of working largely in the South, in the Republic, through a health lens, but having worked and working in academia, but having done time in government department, Department of Health, in NGOs, and in a North-South body. So I think I've lots of different lenses into it. That said, I think it's getting much better. I think it's much better now than it was 15 years ago or 25 years ago when I begun this work. And I think part of that is that there's more people doing this policy and research work. I disagree with loads of what Michael said. I really enjoyed your presentation, but I disagree with loads. And fundamentally, I think you're wrong. I think civil servants do read academic papers, because I get lots of emails and engagements from civil service or health system leaders who do read academic papers. But I write my academic papers for health system leaders and politicians and policymakers to read, right? So there's a two-way thing. There's an onus on us to write them in a way that people actually want to read them, and also to put ourselves out there and communicate them in an accessible way so that people listen on them, and to hold them to account, and that requires advocacy or whatever. In terms of, so just to finish on the ugly, you know, I totally agree with Alan's point. Is I think there's a real mismatch between how policymakers work and how academic researchers work. There's big difference in timelines, there's difference in budgets, there's differences in the natures of our employment. I remember trying to get a very senior person in the Department of Health to sign up to a research grant, which needed to be submitted the next day, and basically having to find his mobile number and text him when you have to tick yes, because my precarious postdoc contract is dependent on you signing up to this agreement. And that person coming back to me afterwards going, I had no idea you weren't in a cushy job in a university. But the reality is that most postdoc researchers do on average 10 years before they get an academic post. And in fact, most postdocs don't get academic, you know, so just this real lack of understanding in both worlds of how each other's operated. In terms of how it can work, I think initiatives like the Shared Island Initiative have absolutely changed the agenda, because it is coming from on top, and that's really welcome. But obviously, it's the on top areas that the government wants us to look at or do. And there's lots of other areas that maybe people in this room need to look at that aren't so politically acceptable, that the government has a poor track record on. And I'd encourage you to keep on doing those ones, as well as the ones that are initiated or sponsored or whatever by government. And having spent most of my whatever type of career it is, research, policy, media career, being on the cold outside, not doing research that's popular, if you hang around for long enough, these windows of opportunity emerge where you can come in, and then you'll Alan will know this too, you'll spend a long time in the cold again, and then you'll be brought back in. And so that, I think those initiatives that are like my current or my previous grant, like which is collaboration between the HSE and the Department of Health and HRB funded, like the Sphere PhD program, which Kieran is an alumni of, and so am I, where there's a real push on making our research policy relevant. They're all government funded. And I would think ultimately, you know, how many people in this room's salary is not paid out of public money in one way or other? But I think if our salaries are paid out of public money, we've an obligation to produce research that's useful for society, that contributes to a better outcome, and to get policymakers to use that and implement.
Thank you. And I'm thinking of two things there, which is, you know, the window of opportunity. And I think Michael did allude to that as well in his talk, which is, you know, it's not that you're going out every day doing the business of influencing policy, but you might have to wait for windows of opportunity to arise, and the point is to be ready for those windows of opportunity is what I'm hearing. And the second part, I think, which is just really important, is the writing. I know myself, when I started off, I was teaching teachers, and then I would work in schools, and I would go out and be like, oh God, if only schools would use evidence. And then when we actually started looking at the evidence and we started doing these kind of community of practices, reading papers, we realized, well, God, this is really just not at the level where teachers could actually use this in the classroom. So I think the writing is so important, even if it's just at the end of a paper, like translating what you've said into is that, so do you think that's improving in some way? Do you think people are more aware now of like having to write for the people on the ground or the policymakers? You know, is that still a barrier, or is that something that's improving from your perspective?
Just come in very briefly, like certainly in Sphere, in the PhD program, like all the scholars would be required to do policy briefs based on their academic publications. So I think instilling that from the earliest opportunity, and I think in general, places have got better at that. Would you agree?
the first thing I'm going to do is come back to your point when you said that policymakers read academic papers. I mean, I feel you're lucky if people are reading your policy. I don't think academics are reading my academic papers, let alone the policymakers not. So I was feeling really envious when you said that. I actually think it goes much further than writing things in a way that are accepted. You have to be talking to people. Okay. And look, again, I'd say if we went around the room and everybody sort of asked them, how many papers have you promised yourself you will read in the next month? Okay. And how many of you arrive at the end of every month and say, well, I'm never going to get to read them. I'll just, start the new. Like, there is such a volume of stuff coming through now that it is impossible to read it all. So it really, really means then that you need to be talking pretty directly to people. And like over the years, the ESRI has been in existence for sort of 65 years now, and we were set up specifically with the idea of influencing policy. So this is really something we sort of agonized about for a very, very long time. And I think over time, the way things have sort of evolved is that ongoing connection and discussion is just really central to what we're now doing. And it does mean, again, back to one of Michael's points, we keep a sort of an ear out for, well, what are the major issues that government is actually interested in? Okay, it shouldn't drive the totality of your agenda, but at the same time, if there are issues that people are interested in, and you have the skills and the capacity to influence, that you want to take those opportunities, it's absolutely critical too that you're also asking the questions that the state or government officials are not asking. Okay, they may not be asking questions partly because, again, as you were saying, the sort of forward-oriented things that may not be on their agenda, or there may be the questions that are just sort of uncomfortable for them, so they're not going after those ones as well. But I think it really is that dialogue and that close connection, and back, the concepts of relationships, breaking down those culture clashes, bringing your message sort of very, very directly to people. But again, in all fairness to people here, that takes an awful lot of time and energy. And I mean, in terms of sort of structures, and it comes back a little bit about sort of, what somebody like the Department of Further and Higher Education to do, how do we influence the universities, I think, to value that sort of activity more? I mean, if they don't value it more, it's just not going to happen. Okay, because we're all human. But I think there is an onus, and back to your point about when everybody is essentially on the public purse or being paid from the public purse, that it should be possible. But that really is, I think, a big challenge for the department.
Johnathan or Leonora, do you want to?
No, I was going to say, yeah, it is absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things to say there. And I have my notes in front of me because the last time I spoke, I forgot to mention major initiatives and stuff that was going on. So please excuse me. But I think, the reality is that policymaking is such a messy exercise that if you want to start really building those connections with researchers, there's a lot of it really needs to come down from the top. It needs to be about organizational change, both on the higher education side and also on the department side. And it needs to be kind of built into, I know that frameworks can be a bit, but the best we have sometimes, it needs to start being built into those frameworks. It needs to be built into things like the competency and capability frameworks on the civil service side, and it needs to be built into promotional frameworks. And particularly for younger researchers as well, we need to start figuring out how to give them the space to engage, because they're particularly challenged in engaging, because I suppose there's short-term contracts and there's additional challenges. They're not in the rooms where policy interaction actually happens. So from the department's point of view, I suppose there's a couple of things that we've tried to set up, and the other thing to say is an awful lot going on at European level that we're plugged into. Things around reforming of research assessment and reforming of research careers. There's a new European research area program being rolled out at the moment. We're involved in actions there. From my own perspective, what we've been trying to do is establish structures to promote this. So we established a civil service research network, which is research leads from across all government departments. That's actually been hugely helpful, because some departments are very good at engaging with researchers and have had, I suppose, the support and resources and leadership within their own departments to really bring forward this agenda. And some departments haven't. So it's been a good forum for us to it's just a sharing forum on how we actually engage. If we do knowledge brokerage events, how do they roll out? Trying to promote that idea of publishing your research priorities, how to bring together research priorities in departments, which is really, really difficult, because a policymaker is just going to deal with the brief or the crisis or whatever that's in front of them. So it needs to nearly come down from the top, that you actually have to start thinking about future research priorities. So that's what that network is trying to do. We established a network also on the higher education side of Research and Policy Network, which is advocates crossing the at the higher education institutions. Now we need to kind of give that a bit of a kind of a bump again. We had brought them together with our Civil Service Research Network at an event last October, which was very useful because it was about building that understanding about the challenges and constraints on both sides, and about, like, a lot of researchers didn't realize how complex research the policy can be, and how you're at the mercy of political will. And also, I suppose, departments don't understand how researchers will say, adhere to these timescales and don't respond to procurement or consultations. So it's just about breaking down those barriers and building that understanding. But I suppose, yeah, I would agree absolutely that from the department's perspective, and that's what I suppose the strategy is trying to do, it's trying to really build in policy supports. And even, I think, a couple of things that have happened over the last year, the establishment of, or the appointment of Government Science Advisor, and the establishment of Research Ireland. I know there's a few people from Research Ireland here. That's huge, because it finally brings together the STEM and HSS disciplines, because policy challenges are never just in a discipline, they are multidisciplinary. And we're also, the RNI Act that underpins that has policy relevant research as one of its statutory obligations. So I think putting in place those kind of measures, those networks, those structures, the funding agency, I think it'll help bring that along, and finally put in resourcing into policy relevant research as well, and support researchers.
Leonora, thank you. And it's really interesting to hear about the networks that you're setting up. And, you know, and I think you can see with the appetite that's in the room and from your comments that there is more of an emphasis on academics working with policymakers. But of course, that means that everybody wants to work with policymakers, and policymakers are few and far between themselves. And I think Johnathan, so I want to bring Johnathan back in here, because you talked about the convening power of the YEI, which is fantastic. But, you know, what's appropriate, and how can we make it more accessible for the everyday ESRI that doesn't have the convening power of the YEI, or perhaps how can the YEI amplify the everyday researcher who isn't a part of a structure like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, I'm going to be talking about initiatives that are specific to us, but I don't think will be unique to us in terms of what government departments are thinking about at the minute. And it kind of leans on that conversation around windows of opportunity. And we recognize that that is a challenge, and we don't want it to be so reactionary. And that's very often our issue. So within the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, we have 2 initiatives to try and address that. And there's opportunities here for you to bring your members and others into it at this point. Something called Areas of Research Interest, which is a cross UK government program to essentially to do what we're talking about here, is to establish what are the big research questions we have, and to articulate very clearly how you can engage with and contribute to those. So that's really important, and that hasn't been there historically. So this process of determining where does my expertise fit into the policy mix, where's the opportunity, how can I land it? That's not always clear, and I think that's been a huge barrier. So Areas of Research Interest will be a really good facilitator in that regard. And in DAERA in Northern Ireland, we as a principle have a process of, I don't want to say co-design, but it's close to it, where we will engage with our stakeholders to, first of all, make sure, are these the right questions? Are these the right research priorities? We think they are, but we're not always right. And to get their views on that. Underpinning those areas of research interest, we also have evidence plans. So we're kind of waking up to the idea that not every question requires a new research project. And not every question requires a research project that we fund ourselves. We need to be a lot smarter in leveraging the research that's already out there. So by conveying what our interests are at a high level, and then in granular detail, we want to give researchers and other stakeholders every opportunity to see where they fit in and how they can contribute across the board. So as I've said, we're engaging very broadly with our stakeholders, Young Academy Ireland, through Connor, through members in Northern Ireland, and hopefully, you know, across the board, we can feed in your input and your thoughts on it. We're very keen that it is reflective of the broad expertise that organizations like this can lean upon. And we live on a small island, relatively speaking. We have shared problems.
Yeah, it's really heartening to hear. And all four of you have reflected back like that you're really interested in engaging with academics and particularly ECRIs, which is, it's really warming as a mid-career researcher, and I'm sure for other researchers in the room, to hear that kind of, that generosity and that interest in kind of bridging the gap. And it's really good to hear that you're kind of looking for that expertise, because, I think from a research perspective, particularly if we started putting it into promotion applications, it becomes a bit like the Hunger Games. And, everybody wants to get on where I think what I'm hearing from you is a really nice model of like making sure that everybody has an opportunity to input in some way, whether it's at a kind of a wide level and somebody's taking a lead, but everybody has the opportunity for the research potentially to be heard in a space where it could influence policy, which, I think is really good. Now, I want to really come to each of you individually as well, because not only have you got good perspective on the broader kind of issues around research for policy making and that relationship, you also have very strong expertise in specific areas that I think would be of interest to people in the room. So I might come to you individually and ask with questions. So for example, Sarah, can I go to you first? So you were very involved in Sláinte Care reform, which I think is just it's a hugely influential initiative within the country, and it's, wide change, integration of systems. There's just so much that's involved in Sláinte Care. So can you tell me maybe what lessons from Sláinte Care reform that early career researchers can take about engaging constructively with policymakers doing these type of major reforms that really change how a country does its work in terms of healthcare? Sorry.
No, not briefly.
No,
I'll try and pick out one or two things. I guess my involvement came about because an Oireachtas committee was established under the Programme for Government in 2016, because the government didn't know what to do about health policy. Roisin Shortall proposed this special committee, and Roisin Shortall then became the chair of that committee. And they tendered for technical support from academia. And we responded to that tender, and we're terrible usually at responding to those government tenders because they're really short and they're never enough money, and it's not worth doing it, and you've got to do all your existing things anyway. Anyway, we tendered for it and we got it. And initially it was just to provide 3 workshops with the members of the Oireachtas committee around health system reform. And we hosted the first ever workshops, only ever workshops, held in Dole Éireann. We to get them to give us access to the restaurant, because there's actually no flat spaces where you can have workshops in the Dole. It's all debating, it's all confrontational. And after those 3 workshops, then they extended the contract so that we provide technical support. And a lot of what we did then, I really would challenge the idea that policymakers don't use evidence, because our job was gathering the evidence every time the TDs came up with the question. So what do we need to do for palliative care for children? We'd do a quick and dirty look at the evidence and bring it back to the committee the next week and say it to them. And actually, the answer to most questions they asked us tended to be earlier prevention, interventions at an earlier stage, particularly children, and more nurses tend to be, no matter what question they asked us. It sounds very simple, but that tended to be the evidence. So a lot of that was providing the evidence. And even though the Oireachtas committee was all colours, like from Mick Barry, who wanted to nationalise all pharmaceutical companies in Ireland, to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, who held the majority. So if you to get something through, you have to get, and or Fine Gael. Actually, what we found was when you had good evidence, safe space, get most people to vote. And for me, that was a really valuable lesson. And also, they went way up in my expectations, actually. The politicians, they were like the best students I ever had. They did read the papers, Alan. And then they go home to their constituencies and they come back the next week going, oh, no way. We can't take tax relief or private health insurance, even if it's the equitable response, because no one's going to vote for me if we do that. So they had this great pragmatism of taking on board the evidence and then politically possible. So to bring that around, so I had a very good experience of working with politicians in that instance, and obviously the Secretariat was by and large managed by the Department of Health, not ourselves. So my advice would be to get Alan's point, and obviously you're not going to get to work with parliamentary committees. I've been doing 20 years of research before that happened, but it's doing the early groundwork, going to conferences, getting your your research, your work out there, doing any, no matter how small media you can, local radio, building up your confidence, getting on panels, saying yes, that shoe lever. I do agree with the shoe lever, absolutely. You know, that's how you begin to get to permeate. But I think a lot of it is about building up trust. And lots of people in the Department of Health, the HSE, mightn't like what the research I'm involved in says, but they trust it and they respect it. And I think it's understanding that we might absolutely differ in opinions on things, but if the research is of a good quality, and we do that consistently, that does reap.
Really helpful. Thank you, Sarah. And I might bring in Johnathan here. Johnathan, in terms of your work, you know, and looking ahead at the changing demographics, particularly in your field, and the labour market challenges, you know, what kind of challenges specifically do you think are going to require that stronger cross-island evidence and policy collaboration? For Biggie.
Yes. I mean, it covers everything really, doesn't it? There is a lot going on in terms of collaborative effort. So some of you may be familiar with the co-center programs that address big climate, food issues that are shared agendas. So there's a lot of work in that space already, but, you know, in terms of the big ticket items, you know, from our perspective, climate action, things like nutrient action programs to try and address, you know, environmental pollution, water quality, and One Health in general. These are huge, intractable problems that are a long time in the making, and as the line goes for us, will be a long time in the fixing. But there are opportunities everywhere, and I read scientific papers from some colleagues in the room. I think it's really important that you find the knowledge brokers. Those are the key individuals, because the focus is often on engaging directly with policy colleagues, and that's a good thing to do. And there's always resilience in diverse networks, and that's what you want to foster to make sure that you have an opportunity to have an influence. But within many departments, and certainly in our department, the Chief Scientific Advisor's Office has grown from 10 individuals 2 years ago to almost 50. And I think that's a really positive signal, I think, for what the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs thinks about gathering, exploiting and acting upon evidence, which is really encouraging. And just to assure, you know, those in the room and those listening, we're trying to find you. We want to find good evidence and use that. And increasingly in the public dialogue around policy, one of the many challenges is how to manage scientific uncertainty. And although I'm speaking about science, you know, you can translate that into uncertainty of evidence of any type. But for us, how to communicate uncertainty in a fair and understandable way without that being picked up by stakeholders as a weakness. And very often that's the challenge we have. We can convey a scientific position, an evidence position that informs a policy, but whenever stakeholders scrutinize the science underpinning it, often they're looking for those weaknesses. Now, we know as researchers, as scientists in the room, that that's just good practice. But informing that public dialogue is really important. So yes, you can inform policy directly, but I think communicating your expertise publicly is really important. We all have a job in that regard, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Johnathan. And just, Alan, can we just go to you for a moment? So just in terms of your perspective around cross-island collaboration piece, you know, do you have any kind of priority areas that you're looking at that you wish to engage in, academics or early career researchers? What is on your priority list at the moment?
Okay, I mean, I'll answer this without having thought about it, which is obviously a slightly dangerous thing to do. I mean, in terms of the all-island dimension of what we're talking about, I mean, I think there is a sort of developing collaborations across the academics, okay, on the island of Ireland, which is very positive. And again, the various programs that have been mentioned have been there. I do think in terms of the sort of the receptiveness or whatever like that to evidence for policy, I do think there is a difference north and south. Now, I mean, I may be talking more from a sort of a social science perspective rather than a, you know, a science perspective, I can put it like that. That I think when it comes to the social sciences, that issue I was describing earlier on about sort of, you know, suspicion of results and stuff like that, and results sort of seem to be attacking. But Northern Ireland sort of still sort of strikes me, and again, this is research that my colleagues at the Institute and others have been doing, and work I've come in contact through my time in the Fiscal Council on Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is still an area with phenomenal unexploited potential. I mean, economically, it still lags substantially behind both the Republic and most regions in the United Kingdom. So there is a whole host of things that could happen in Northern Ireland. And again, as was sort of touched on, this isn't requiring lots of new research projects or whatever like that. This is really about the application of a lot of lessons that have been learned in other places over a very, very long time. But I mean, I've had conversations with senior civil servants and indeed with politicians in Northern Ireland, and these are all very sane, sensible people who want the best for Northern Ireland. But there's just always this breakdown that once it moves into a sort of a public arena, certain positions then get adopted. And I've been really, really struck again is that when you try and talk about the problems economically or socially in Northern Ireland, one group of people almost takes that as an attack on their identity. And there is a sort of refusal. I can give one example. I mean, education in Northern Ireland is failing a substantial proportion of people in Northern Ireland. Okay, and I think this is well understood by lots of people, but for some extraordinary reason, there is a group of people who still maintain that Northern Ireland has one of the finest education systems in the world. Okay, there's just a refusal, in a sense, I think, to you know, interact with some issues. So for me, on the shared island perspective, I don't mean this in a sort of an arrogant Southern perspective. I genuinely mean it, that there is incredible potential in Northern Ireland. I think if policy making started adopting a lot of the lessons that are there, and for me that would be the absolute priority. And again, back to the nature of the group that are here, like the Royal Irish Academy and the Young Academy are unique organizations in terms of being 32 county. I think apart from some of the sports organizations of the trade union movement, you might be amongst the only genuinely 32 county. So you know, the role that you can play in this, I think is potentially really valuable.
Fantastic. You know, even for us, the ESRI occupies this space, I suppose, admirable space that sits between policy and research. You know, a lot of so many people in the ESRI, they're producing very high level research and translating it directly into policy.
Curiously, there's no ESRI in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
So it'd be great if you could expand
there used to be, okay, not only was there one, at one stage in Northern Ireland, there was a Northern Ireland Economic Research Council and a Northern Ireland Economic Council. Okay, so it's a bit like people fronted Judea territory, but there were actually two economic research institutes in Northern Ireland. They were blended into one, the Economic Research Institute of Northern Ireland, ERINI. Okay, and a number of years ago, the Northern Ireland executive got it into its head that it wanted to close down some, amalgamate some bodies. The only one they managed to close down was the Research Institute in Northern Ireland. Okay, so there are groups within the, for example, in the University of Ulster, there is an economic policy centre, and there are, okay, but there's no, what you would consider like something like, you know, the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London or the ESRI, there's no equivalent in Northern Ireland, which I think is a gap. But I think the bigger question is, well, why is that gap there?
Yeah. Food for thought. So we're going to come to you, Leonora, and after you, we're going to go and throw it out. So hopefully there's some questions here in the audience for the panel. So Leonora, just you have been very generous in your insights from the various schemes that you've worked in. But just again, maybe just drawing on your experience with initiatives like Science for Policy and the ERC schemes, you know, what best practices have you seen amongst early to mid-career researchers in terms of influencing policy making, or maybe what have been some of the pitfalls that you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the EU level, actually, this is big on the agenda. And I suppose it's big on the agenda, Science for Policy, I mean, because they're trying to retain trust in government and they're trying to retain trust in science. And so bringing the two together, I suppose it helps kind of, if you have science built into policy responses, it just gives us that level of robustness. And it kind of justifies the decision making or helps to explain the decision making. And so it's really being driven at the European level. And we're involved in a number of different initiatives there, and even in terms of engaging in those networks, they've actually been very useful for us in terms of informing the approach that we take here, and also our opportunity to feed in our experiences at the European level. So the first thing I'd say is that the European Commission, there's a joint research centre, which is like the research arm of the European Commission, and their website is well worth visiting because they have competency frameworks for both policymakers and researchers in the science for policy space, and they're just good, and they're interesting to look at because they talk a lot about, I think, that really important piece around communicating uncertainty and around dissemination, communication, those types of skills. The other thing we haven't touched on actually that, and I won't get into it now too much, but the role of citizen engagement and public engagement, and how important researchers are there, particularly for policymakers, because they're feeding back what's actually going on the ground, what's going on in local communities. They're bringing that experience in. And we did a consultation a couple of years back to inform, I suppose, a framework engagement that we're working on. And one of the things that came through was that a lot of researchers and institutions were engaging in public engagement and local initiatives as a way of cutting their teeth in the research and policy space. So I would say if there's opportunities like that you can get involved in, that it's well worth doing so. Back to the European level, though, there's a few things that I would say. First of all, we have received funding as a department to do kind of a mapping of the evidence ecosystem. So it's called the Technical Support Instrument, and I think this is going to be very helpful for us in terms of reflecting on how we have been trying to roll out initiatives in the science for policy research policy space over the last couple of years, and in terms of the good, the bad and the ugly, maybe highlighting the things that have worked and haven't worked, etc. So through that, then we've been able to build up networks as a community of practice as well at the European level, and we're sharing our experiences of doing things like public service fellowships, for example. And I say that now because I know I mentioned Research Ireland colleagues are here, but keep an eye on the Research Ireland website, because the public service fellowship is a particularly important instrument for us in terms of bringing that engagement and that mobility into comments into, I suppose, that engagement, and there is a call coming up soon. So bringing it back to your question, though, yeah, absolutely, engaging in Europe has been very informative for me personally, even in terms of understanding how knowledge is coming across the policy and research interface. Like I said, it's not transactional, it's really a social process, and that's, again, bringing it back to building up those relationships so that we kind of understand each other, and I suppose understand how these research insights can be brought into policy and how they are understood effectively.
Well, thank you, Leonora. So I'm going to open it to the floor now. So would anybody like have a question for our panel?
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm really enjoying the perspective, actually. I've got my notes down, scribbling, if I can read my own writing. So I guess we've understood and we've heard that there's a disconnect between academics and policymakers, and I think we all agree with that. But I do think that we might be unconsciously perpetuating that. And by that I mean, if you look at the Young Academy Ireland, it's a fantastic organization, and I really do think it's a bridge between policymakers and society in general. But there is an initiative, not to pick on the YAI specifically, but there's a requirement for a PhD. I'm sure there's a reason for that. I'm sure this will come out of a lot of discussions, but most of the policy influencers, and I say influencers, not makers, most of the policy influencers that I know don't have PhDs. Mm-hmm. They have real, tangible, lived experiences. Now, if you block out that, you're losing out in a very big pool of expertise. So, I mean, for example, moving an entire village for mining, you won't have a lot of PhDs with that understanding, with that vision, who have seen that, who've seen the impact socially. You're missing out on that. So I do wonder, going back to the beginning, about the goal of fair and inclusive society, if that can really materially be realized if you are only rubbing shoulders with your own group. Now, I don't know, I'm sorry, it's not really a question, but please feel free.
Yep, go for it, Johnathan.
I mean, it's an interesting point, and I suppose I'll speak to that from my perspective rather than trying to address itself. We do have a bit of a disconnect in that we very often want simple metrics to make decisions. So we wanted something quantifiable that will tell us about what an effect will be. But actually, when you get down to what changes the dial, very often it's stories, it's narrative. So we talk about impact a lot quantitatively, but it's the qualitative that actually can have a disproportionate impact. And I think we do need to recognize that, and government needs to find a better way to engage with it. And just a quick example. So in my role, I've been involved in co-production working groups to develop a new rural policy for Northern Ireland. And it's been fantastic because we've been able to bring in community representatives, stakeholders, NGOs, and listen to their stories of change. We have an understanding of how statistics at a national level don't always convey the reality at a sort of resolution that matters for rural communities. And I think my reflection is that there is a tension there. And I think collectively we need to find a better way of managing that, because what changes policies, what changes the opinions of politicians, it's very often individual stories. So it's just a reflection of what you were saying.
I might take another question just so that we can get a few questions in the short space of time we have, although I know you probably all have a perspective on that. Can we take another question?
Hi, Martina Rooney from the Co-Centre for Sustainable Food Systems. Thank you. That's been really, really informative this morning. And I think my question is directed firstly to Sara Burke, but actually to everybody. So we are now like training the next generation of PhD students. And I love what you said about the SPHERE program. And I know some of the people who did that. And now key for them is like turning their academic papers into policy papers. What other recommendations or what other training or advice can we give to our PhD students to get them into that policy mindset or policy communication and networking at that stage?
Okay. I think another thing that happens on the SPHERE program is placements. So the scholars get to go on a national and international placement, and often the placement will be in a statutory organisation or an NGO or an advocacy group or a government department. And then an international placement, which is often more academic. But I think that placement and also that the public service fellowships, I think we need much more of that to build those connections early in careers between researchers and academics. Just back to the point of the previous speaker, like I could argue your point either way, right? I think it's a totally valid point and a good one to make. But I think in a way, if you're an early career researcher or policymaker, and that's the aim of the group, then start with the group you have, and then others, you can bring in others along the way, or there's different forms. And I think Michael made a really good point, and I totally agree with that about there's loads of ways to have policy impact. And you might be a grassroots activist, or you might be a really anarchy academic like Michael, who's bridged the policy sphere, or you can be a politician, you can be do work in the media, so there's let's be open to all sorts of ways rather than saying it. And obviously I'm not here to defend why AI, I find it hard to say, but they've chosen this route now, and I guess I would respect that. And then to loop back just finally to the second point, I don't think you can say it often enough just about people doing their masters and their PhDs and early career researchers, just getting out there and meeting people. And certainly as someone supervising students who lived a lot of their lives at home on their own, on screens during COVID, they are allergic. They're allergic to coming to the office, right? They're allergic to meeting people, and just that practice of, like, we give them a task in the master's program of, you've got to go to a conference and ask a question, and you've got to get someone to video it and bring it back and show it to us, right? And just standing up, my name is Sara Burke and I want to ask you a question. Just doing that, just getting yourself out there and becoming a bit of a pest to the politician or the civil servant or the health system leader, and them getting to know you, I think hopefully does you credit in the long run.
Thank you so much, Sara. We might take one more question down here at the back. Oh, sorry, we do have another question. Yeah, okay, go for it.
Thanks, super interesting discussion. From my experience, the actions and the choices that early career researchers make, they don't necessarily have autonomy over them. They're often driven by either their PI or what the funders are designating as important. And I think that this is where a lot of the push towards publications comes from, because this is how we get money. So I suppose, although the advice is brilliant and would love if that could be actioned, you know, just through our own desire, I am wondering, how do we incentivize funders to actually allow us to be incentivized to action?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it goes back to the ecosystem. Alan, Leonora, would one of you like to take that?
Okay, obviously it's not an easy question, but I mean, I think as individuals and as younger, I think it's very difficult to do anything. But I think through the Young Academy and more broadly to the Royal Irish Academy, I mean, I honestly do believe universities need to reorientate the incentive systems so that there is much more credit, I think, given you know, for people who engage in these activities. I mean, just to back it up even very, very slightly, apart from doing the policy evidence interaction, whatever, like when I began my academic career 30 years ago, okay, probably even a bit more than that now, one of the bits of advice I was given is never have the word Ireland in the paper, in the title of your paper. Okay, and then we came up with all sorts of bizarre, like we were a small regional economy, or so. You tried to come up with something that made it sort of sound general, because the number of times your paper would be rejected purely on the basis that, oh, that's Ireland, you know, we're not going to do that. So writing in Ireland is a bit easier than it was many, many years ago, but like doing work on Irish policy is simply not going to get you published in most of the journals that you guys would want to get into. And, you know, again, multiply that by a factor of about 10 for Northern Ireland. Okay, so it just really becomes very, very difficult. So I think there is a bigger sort of, you know, structural issue here, and we can have all the conversations we want around it. But I think unless there are, you know, leadership is really shown here, and sort of sending clear signals that this thing matters, I think that there's a real difficulty. Just one last point, actually, on the issue again about, you know, bits of training and doctoral programs or whatever like that. Again, on the point that you made, doing placements in civil service organizations, if you're really into this, there's no better way of doing it. There's also, like, in terms of advisory boards, and departments are often looking for these sort of things. And the other thing is that I think academics tend to go to academics conferences, which again is 100% understandable, and there's only so many hours of the day and days of the week, so on and so forth. But often there are more sort of policy oriented conferences that they're almost like two distinct audiences. Okay, you know, the guest speaker might be an academic or something like that, but, you know, generally those sort of things. So if you can weave your way in and doing all those things, it's good. But having said all of that, I have great sympathy that if you are, be it a junior researcher or somebody making your way, and the university basically says to you that, you know, publishing in peer-reviewed journals and the more prestigious the better, that's the track to success. It is very, very difficult to try and sort of break away from that.
Rhiannon, do you want to come in last?
Yeah, I might just come in very quickly. Look, I think it's an area that's emerging, and it's very slow to change, but it is changing. And I think even things like, as you were saying, Alan, the recognition mechanisms, we're starting to see it in HEIs, that they are starting to put in structures and supports for researchers to engage in policy. Sometimes they've got a research policy interface or office, or they're recruiting specialists to do this. And we're starting to see the impact of that. Even things like the COARA, the Coalition for Research Assessment Alliance, I've completely forgotten the full title of it. COARA is what we call it anyway in the department. Is things like that are starting to push that agenda around recognizing diverse outputs from research. So I think all that will change. And like I said, even the National Funding Agency, but now that it's actually really built into to their strategic objectives and their statutory obligations, we are working on it. It takes a while, but it's starting to really build up programs to support policy relevant research, while we still, you know, keep the space for emerging, innovative, blue skies research and excellent research. That we are trying to develop those programs. Even things like new foundations, that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's a good way to kind of cut your teeth into doing that little bit of policy. The other thing is through the Civil Service Research Network, like I mentioned, they're doing, departments are increasingly doing knowledge brokerage events. So keep an eye out for them. Keep an eye on department websites as well. Open consultations, public consultations are a good way of starting to feed into policy. So there's diverse ways as well. And at a practical level, look at people in your departments, in your academic departments who are having impact. Ask them how they do it, because sometimes people like that, and I think Alan mentioned advisory boards, we found researchers through people who have been involved in advisory boards who've been able to tell us who's doing what in their departments. So it's a myriad of things. It's not just one route. But yeah, talk to people who you see do it as well. It's a very good way.
Thanks, Leonora. I know you can't believe it, but we're actually out of time. Because that conversation was just, I mean, I was so interested in everything that was said, and I think it was a really good conversation with really new insights there. But I will give you like 30 seconds each to make some concluding remarks, maybe alluding to that building of the ecosystem for early to career researchers. We might go back to yourself, Leon, and work across the room.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, like I said, we're working on it. It's a slow process. We're heartened by the fact that we have the support now to look at the mapping of the evidence ecosystem with our partners in Europe, and to try and see where the gaps are. Please keep an eye on the Research Ireland website. I would say there are opportunities there to engage. So just at a practical level, do that and keep engaging. I think this network in particular is really useful. It is through these structures and networks that we start to share and learn about how we actually engage effectively and to see the opportunities to engage.
Johnathan.
Yeah, so very quickly, all Northern Irish government departments will be publishing their areas of research interest. I'm led to believe this calendar year. You don't have to live or work in Northern Ireland to have something to say about the questions that we're asking, because very often they're the same questions that are being asked here as well. So I would encourage you to think more broadly about where your research and your evidence can land, and we'd be very grateful to engage with anybody.
Fantastic. Sarah?
I think despite the fact that all the incentives are about academic publications and rewarding individuals, my primary piece of advice would be to collaborate. Collaborate with each other, collaborate with NGOs, collaborate with local communities, with politicians, with the leaders in statutory bodies. And if you do that now, that works over time, and it makes that hard, lonely, precarious, poorly paid work of an early career researcher more doable.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And Alan, last but not least.
So I've not been too sort of grandiose about it, but I think as I look back in my career, I sort of asked the question, well, sort of what gives greatest satisfaction now? Was it a paper in the Journal of X, Y, and Z? Or was it a policy initiative that I might have played some tiny role in? And it's one of these sort of, you can think about your legacy when you're old, but it's probably better to think about your legacy when you're young, because you could do something about it. And in spite of all the barriers that I was talking to, I think there is no greater sort of sense of achievement and contribution than impacting on policy in a way that makes people's lives better. And again, we can get kind of consumed by incentives in a narrow sort of way, but I think if you think in those sort of terms, it will sort of point you in the right direction, maybe.
Thank you so much, Alan. And I just want to sincerely thank you all for your time today. I know you're very busy people, and I think it's been really worthwhile for us to have you here in the room together. And I'm sure if you're staying for lunch, people can approach you, because I know there was probably several more questions in the room. So hopefully you'll get to continue the conversation over lunch. So enjoy the lunch, everybody, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks again to Jenny and the panel. And just to say that